Yeah, it's true.
Just remember, you can't laugh at things like that when they happen in the clinic. We have to leave the room. Okay. Anybody else?
Anyone
For posterity?
Have a fortune or what?
No.
Oh.
I feel like I should be standing in back of a lectern, you know, NBC, ABC, CNN. And I promise I have a program.
Since you promised.
I have a policy. Oh, another one. Okay. All right. Radiobiology is actually easy. For what you're going to need to know for your test is relatively easy. I think the ASRT, I think there's only like 10 questions or 12 questions on there that are radiobiology related. It's a difficult lecture to give only because there are people that do PhDs in this. When I was in grad school, I had to sit through 3 hours twice a week for 10 weeks. And it was still kind of scraping the edge of it, and that was a long time ago. Things have really changed a lot. But the basics haven't. So, here's the biologic effect. Nothing's changed about this. There's a lot of different things that occur. It starts when, as soon as you push that button, hold your breath, beep, okay. Radiation exposure creates either ionization or excitation or both. And we'll talk about the difference, but there's a direct effect or there's interaction with water. This creates some sort of a molecular alteration. And then you have one of 3 different pathways, all of which goes through what we call enzymatic repair. This is a field that, now you could do probably an entire class for a quarter on everything they've just recently learned within the last 2 years on enzymatic repair. This field of biology, whether it's radiobiology, chemobiology, whatever, this is really expanding quickly. Okay, you have this pathway, so you have biochemical lesions that may lead to cell death. Immediate effects, of course, you've got death, organ dysfunction, tissue damage. Biochemical lesions can lead to cell death, which in turn can lead to late somatic effects, leukemia, cancer, tissue damage. There's something here called recovery from sublethal damage. It basically takes care of what happens here, so it ameliorates kind of these effects. There's a latent period between here and here. That can be weeks, months, usually years. Then we have point mutations. Again, with a latent period, there's some selection and repair, and that results in genetic damage. We'll talk about it in detail later, but the first thing I want you to know is what we do in diagnostic X-ray, we don't worry about this. The reason we don't worry about this is because the amount of exposure required to make that happen is very large, and you have to do it to a large number of people. They've been following the atomic bomb survivors since 1945, and so they have a pretty good handle, because several generations have now been born, they have a pretty good handle on how much of this leads to this. And it's outside of the realm of what we do in our X-ray rooms. Just saying. Anyway, there are recovery and repairs that go on, which is pretty extensive, and they find there are pieces and parts of the cell recently they announced that they thought were junk. They were just things inside of a cell, and they said they don't do anything, so they've been ignoring them, and they've only recently found that those little pieces of junk are actually one of the big providers of repair. So things are changing quickly. Okay. One of the mechanisms is through radiolysis. That's the radiation lysis of water. We are mostly water, so there's a lot of water molecules to interact with. So you have incident photons that interact with a atom and creates a fast electron. Or, of course, once that electron's gone, you now have an ion radical, which can create a free radical. So between the electron creating direct damage, or the free radical basically pulling electrons out, you get a chemical change in DNA. Now, as soon as this occurs, of course, you've got all these little worker bees in here going, we're going to repair this. And we'll talk about how repair occurs and what sometimes happens to it. But in any case, there's usually some sort of a biologic effect on the cell. Either it has to be repaired, maybe it can continue as if nothing occurred, maybe it tries to reproduce and it finds itself that it can reproduce maybe one time, but then after that there's enough damage it can't go on. Sometimes it tries to reproduce and it can't reproduce at all, it just dies. Radiobiology, nobody really knows the official start, but as early as 1906, two French researchers, Beroni and Tribando. My French sucks, but what can I say? That's the best I can. Anybody here speak French?
Only after drinking.
After drinking?
Any language is possible.
Well, I'm not going there. Anyway, what they did is they came up with a couple of observations. They found in the lab that stem cells are radiosensitive, mature cells are radioresistant, younger tissues and organs are radiosensitive, tissues with high metabolic activity are radiosensitive, a high proliferation rate for cells and a high growth rate for tissues result in increased radiosensitivity, and it's only of historical note, has limited application in radiation oncology. I would say actually it has a lot of application in radiation oncology. What tissues do we know of that have a high metabolic activity or a high proliferation rate? Starts with a C. I had it.
Cancer.
Cancer. Okay. Younger tissues and organs being radiosensitive. Who do we think of for that?
Children.
Kids.
Children, fetus, and of course the difference between stem cells, radiosensitive, and mature cells, radioresistant. So, as a function of age, so it would tell you, from a theory point anyway, they believe that my cells are more resistant than your cells because of the difference in age. Okay. So it's not the beginning of radiobiology per se, but these are real important observations that took, believe it or not, the scientific community by storm. They go, really? So let's look at radiation response. So let's look at the cell type. There's radiosensitivity going from high sensitivity to low. So the highly radiosensitive cells are things like lymphocytes, spermatogonia, erythroblasts, intestinal crypt cells. Okay? Intermediate, endothelial cells, osteoblasts, spermatids, fibroblasts. The low are muscle cells and nerve cells. So for example, your brain is really resistant.
Thank God.
It takes a lot of radiation dose to affect the cells in your brain. Nerve cells, same thing. Where this has a bearing, where it changes, is in radiation oncology, when you've got overlapping fields. You have to remember, fields are what? They start at a point source, and they have a pyramidal shape. So what happens if those two ends of the pyramid intersect? You have an area where that dose is double what you think it is. So if dosimetrists make an error and they're doing a spinal lesion, they can actually bifurcate the spinal cord. Radiation just burns it. So you do have to be careful from that point. But this is where you're going to see the effects first: in your blood, in your gut. Okay. In tests, this is your hint. You may be asked to put things in terms of radiosensitivity going from high to low, low to high, or radioresistivity going from low to high or high to low. So make sure when you take your test, regardless whether it's here or for ASRT, you read the question and remember, are they asking for radiosensitivity or radioresistance, and are they wanting you to go from high to low or low to high? Okay? That is the biggest error that I see in this class over the last 8 years. People get those confused. Linear energy transfer and relative biologic effectiveness. So, anybody remember what linear energy transfer is? Actually, it's pretty self-explanatory. Think about it.
Pretty straight.
Go ahead. There's. I won't say there's no wrong answer, but all answers are accepted. At least you're trying. That counts with me. Okay. If somebody walks up and punches you, there's been a linear transfer of energy, right? Or if you get hit in the head with a baseball during a game, or somebody throws a basketball at your body when you're playing, or you're in an automobile accident, there's an energy transfer. Okay, so that's what they're talking about. These are actually measured for different types of radiation. And then for each type of transfer, okay, there is a relative biologic effectiveness. So if you get hit in the head with a baseball, it's a lot different from a biologic effectiveness than if you're in an automobile accident and your head impacts the windshield. Same type of thing. All right, so let's look at different types. We've got 25 million volt X-rays. This would be in radiation oncology. Has a linear energy transfer of 0.2 keV, 1,000 electron volts, so that'd be 200 electron volts per micrometer with a relative biologic effectiveness of 0.8. We got cobalt-60 gamma ray, 1 MeV UV electrons. Diagnostic X-rays are always the base point. Those are always like the 0 point. That's where everything starts. So they're either more or less than diagnostic X-rays. Typically have an LET of around 3 with a relative biologic effectiveness of 1. 10 MeV protons, LET goes up to 4, RBE goes up to 5. Fast neutrons, it's 50 and 10. 5 MeV alpha particles. Anybody remember what an alpha particle is? It's the nucleus of a hydrogen atom. LET of 100, RBE of 20, and then heavy nuclei, you get up to 1,030. So we don't worry about anything here. And we don't really worry about anything here. We're just going to kind of worry about diagnostic X-rays. So there is linear energy transfer and there is a relative biologic effectiveness. And if you graph it out, it has this, almost looks like, what does this curve remind you of? It should remind you of Bremsstrahlung. Kind of the same idea. Okay. Oxygen enhancement ratio is one of the issues in radiobiology. Basically, all that is the ratio between the dose necessary under anoxic conditions to produce a given effect divided by the dose necessary under aerobic conditions to produce the same effect. And again, it has kind of a strange curve. As LET goes up, oxygen enhancement ratio goes down. And this is really important in radiation oncology. For several years, and I think it's still being practiced in some places depending, they would put the patient in a hyperbaric chamber to push oxygen into those cells, get through that outside layer, get into the more of the dead center of a tumor so that it's more sensitive to radiation. There's a lot of things that affect that, but this is one of them. So this is one of the reasons why tumors can be so very difficult to kill, because it's the outside of the mass is active, but you've got that central dead core that is anoxic. And there's no relaxing. You don't get that oxygen effect. Radiosensitivity is a function of age. Obviously, in utero has a very high radiosensitivity. Drops off rapidly into childhood. Childhood and adult, pretty much the same, actually. Then you get up into my generation, and the sensitivity goes up. Why do you think that might be the case?
No immune system.
I mean, we're not really growing, right? Don't mind me, I've always questioned that slide. I've never been able to figure out or find a good reason for why, as you get older, could be that a lot of our cells are dying in the first place. They're more fragile, possibly. It's a whole different medical science around geriatrics. But anyway, this is why we want to know if a patient's possibly pregnant. Very important to know. Yeah. So let's look at, you're going to be sick to death of radiosensitivity and some of the rest of these things. You're going to see them over and over and over again. You get to say goodbye to them as soon as you pass your ASRT. You'll never have to think about this stuff again. Okay, high radiosensitivity. And when they talk about this, they're looking at 200 to 1,000 rads, or 2 to 10 gray. Okay, 2 to 10 gray. This is in the realm of this would be some of your interventional. Maybe CT fluoro would fall into this. You could get that. There are some medical procedures where this would occur. So for lymphoid tissue, and the effect is atrophy. Bone marrow is hypoplasia. Gonads is atrophy. Intermediate, now you're in the 1,000 to 5,000 rad, or the 10 to 50 gray. Definitely fluoro. Special procedures would fall into this. Skin is erythema. GI tract, potentially an ulcer. Cornea would be cataract. Growing bone, it can cause growth arrest. Kidney is nephrosclerosis. Liver ascites. Thyroid is atrophy. This is the big one, cataract and skin. Do skin burns occur in radiology? How many think yes?
Radiation therapy. Radiation therapy.
No, I'm talking about diagnostic.
Oh, diagnostic.
How many say yes? How many say no? How many don't know or don't care? Be honest. I mean, come on. This does happen. It is probably underreported. Once in a while they make the news. You may have seen, I don't know what, maybe, when did I retire? 2006. Probably the early 2000s. A young boy in Northern California had a CT scan, and the technologist was not a very good one. The table did not advance, during the scan. As you know, CT tubes go around, and the table goes through, and you get your CT test, right? Well, the CT was going around, table wasn't advancing, she kept hitting the button, activating it. So this kid is sitting in the same location, constantly having the same area of his head scanned. So the picture in the paper was classic. Band right around here, no hair.
Wow.
Now, are there going to be any other effects from that? I don't know, that made the news and then it all dropped out. I tried, to find out anything else. I could never find out because I was still working. Couldn't find out if that hair loss was permanent or temporary. I know they were arguing about the dose, but it was technologist error. So once that was investigated and determined, I do know that that technologist is no longer working, and the license was lost. So that can occur. It occurs today. Probably in some of the hospitals you're going to work in over your career, it will happen. It won't be reported. It'll be rumors. Vascular fluoro tends to produce that. Lots of high dose rates. It tends to stay in one particular location on the patient's neck. Hair loss happens. It's usually temporary. Erythema occurs, usually temporary. Joint Commission does have a requirement for certain dose levels during fluoro. If you reach that amount of dose of a patient's skin, it has to be reported internally. So that's one thing you have to worry about. Cataracts. So first of all, cornea and cataracts, that's just wrong. Who knows why it's wrong? Where do cataracts occur?
The lens.
The lens of the eye. This came from a published textbook, by the way. Anyway, so yeah, cataracts are an issue. But cataracts is not an all or nothing thing. You don't hit a particular dose and all of a sudden cataracts bloom. Cataracts happen, they start. So you can initiate, they found in Europe, they did studies showing that 2,000 rads, which would be what? 20 gray, to the lens is enough to initiate the beginnings of a cataract. And then they just kind of grow. Interesting perspective from some of the physicians I worked with that actually got some pretty high eye exposures. And we had constant battles about wearing some sort of eye protection, using the hanging shields like they're supposed to. And I actually had one physician, you'll love this, was my worst offender. He said, look, get serious. He says, those things they get in the way. It's not a big deal. He said, I go to my doctor. They pop, you'll love this, they pop my old lens out, they put an artificial lens in, and I'm back to work. Interesting perspective. Again, a physician, they tend to take these things weird. They're a rare breed. Okay, then we get to low. So now you're looking something greater than over 5,000 rads with low radio sensitivity, greater than 50 gray. And that's what it takes for fibrosis in muscle, necrosis in the brain, and transection of the spinal cord. Okay. So that's kind of where it is. So this gives you perspective how much dose it takes for low, intermediate, and high radiosensitivity tissues to have an effect and what those typical effects are. Oh, dose response curves. Anybody ever seen a dose response? Anybody ever seen a curve like this before? Anybody? Do they still teach you about film screen at all, or is that completely dead?
They taught us, but it's dead in our memory.
Yeah, it is
That's
dead.
right, that girl.
Yeah, so this should remind you, for those of you who ever did film, this would remind you of like the H&D curve for film. But these are typical dose response curves. So you have a non-threshold curve like this, which means starting at zero dose, zero effect, and it climbs. Okay. These are threshold effects. This one kind of follows zero response up to some point and then slowly climbs. And then DT, this one actually is a true what they call threshold dose. So it doesn't matter how much radiation you get up to a certain point, and then you start initiating some sort of a response. Okay. The only biologic tissue where they know this occurs is the lens of the eye. So as I said, if we had dose down here, it wouldn't be until you got up to about 2,000 rad to the lens of the eye that you would start seeing, with increasing dose, as you added dose, added dose, added dose, the growth of your problem in your lens. Okay. Cancer risk. Radiation is a carcinogen. It's known, they've known that almost since the instant that Röntgen invented or discovered X-rays. They've known it since the discovery of radioactivity. They know radiation can cause cancer. The argument, and it's still argued today, by the way, they have every 5 years or so radiobiologists from around the world gather in a room. They make sure they take anything that can be thrown away. Everything is nailed down. Honestly, these meetings, I've read reports from people inside, and it almost comes to physical fighting. Because there's two camps. Camp number one says that it follows dose one. This is what we call the linear no threshold. Okay. Linear no threshold came into being after the atomic bombs were dropped in Japan, and they started looking at the doses. Known effects from bomb exposure are up here. The lowest point where they know statistically that something occurred was whole body, 50 rats, okay, or a half a gray. That's known, and it's linear up beyond that. What they didn't know was below, because they didn't have enough people. So they just said, okay, we're going to be conservative. We're going to say it's just zero dose, zero exposure. They're going to take these known effects, they're going to extrapolate them back to here, and that's what they're going to use for radiation protection. Then there's the camp that said, No, because they've discovered since then things that they didn't know back then. And back in World War II, when they dropped those bombs, they had no idea that any kind of repair or recovery occurred. That's a totally foreign thought to them. So it's only probably since the mid-1960s until now they've discovered, wait, something else is going on here. Chernobyl was big for this. We'll talk about what lethal dose was at the time. At the time, a whole body dose of 350 rads, okay, or 3.5 gray, was fatal half the time. Okay. At Chernobyl, they had people who lived with very intensive medical care that received 1,000 rads. So those types of things made them start looking at something's going on, something's going on. Ooh, there's some repair. What does repair? How does repair work? Is it chemical? Is it cellular? What is it? So you have this group that says, no, wait. It's more of curve number 2. So we have, because of repair, these effects are mitigated because of the repair, and it's only when you get up to here that it swamps the repair. So you know you've got a nice straight line. Then you have the folks that say, no. Look at what? The lens of the eye. Anything below a threshold is zero effect. We don't worry about it. So you have all these fights, and they all have data to back up their respective theories. As it turns out, different cell types exhibit different characteristics. Oh, curve number 4, that's the wackos. There were people who were respected, but they believed, because of some erroneous work that was people copied it in the lab and they couldn't get the same result. They could not reproduce the work. And it has since been held to be baloney. Said, no. At low doses, you have an increased effect of cancer, and then it drops down for these known effects. So you may see published material for 4. It is not a legitimate theory. And they just, mostly it's the fight between these two. And they do fight every year. I read an interesting article from one of the gentlemen before he passed who was in the original group, and they were asking him, so where did linear no threshold really come from? Because there's half of the group that says it's baloney, and half the group says, no, that's what we're going to use. And he said, honestly, he said, both of these had the same amount of data after the atomic bombs were dropped. So they flipped the coin. He reported that as a true story. Do I believe it? I know scientists, I don't think it's unlikely. Okay, but these are the main effects. This is what they use, though, to determine what amount of exposure you're allowed to get as a worker. Okay. I think the risk is much less than that. I've never really worked. I've done all the safety things I'm supposed to do, aprons, gloves, blah, blah, blah. I have never worried about radiation exposure when I worked. And I did mostly work with radioactive materials, which I think my lifetime dose, the last time I looked at the film bench report, was something around 25 rads to my hands and something less than that to my body. So, anyway. Okay, dose response curves. Part 2. So, dose-response relationship is multiple things. You've got the natural incidence. Okay. So there's already a natural incidence of cancer. Okay. And we have a pretty good idea what that is. They look at hundreds of thousands of people and cross-match them and match them up for gender and age. And there's this natural incidence. On top of that, you've got the atomic bomb survivor data, and since then they've also added data from Chernobyl. They've also added data from the nuclear accident in Japan, okay, and they extrapolate it down. Okay. Notice the error bars for the known data points from the atomic bomb survivors. These are pretty big error bars. There's another theory, well researched, lots of data that support it, still considered an outlier by the majority of the regulatory folks. Okay. And that's the theory called radiation hormesis that says you have the natural, so this is way down at this end of the curve where you really can't see it here. So you blow that up, you have the natural response for cancer, and as radiation dose goes from 0 up, you get this dip. And then it bypasses the natural response, and this would be where this curve starts, here. There's a lot of data to support that for various different types of cells, cell types. I personally believe in this. That's my personal belief. It's not reflected in any regulatory materials, so you can know about this, but you have to quote this. But I know that's real. I've seen the research that supports that. And think about it. Hormesis happens all the time, okay? If I pick somebody at random in this room and give them a bottle of bare aspirin and ask them to swallow the whole thing, what happens? It's easy. What happens?
They're gonna throw up.
No.
No?
Not going to throw up. They're going to be dead. They're going to have an overdose. They're going to die. But if I give them an aspirin tablet every day until that bottle's gone, what happens? Doctors will tell you, 1 baby aspirin a day if you've had a history of a heart attack, that's good for you, right? It's healthy. So that's what the principle behind hormesis is. For really low dose rates and really low exposures, they have shown for certain cell types this protective piece that says, okay, the risk of cancer goes down at that low end. What they think is that it's kind of like the aspirin example. By constantly, chronically, giving the body exposure to very low levels of radiation background, it stimulates your body to keep those defense mechanisms and your immune system on top, going, okay, we got this nailed. Oh, cancer cell, we got it. So that's the theory. Anyway, something to know about. It's an interesting topic if you want to, some interesting reading and research it. It's pretty cool. Anyway, this is what you're going to get tested on. This is what you need to know. Linear, no threshold. Exclamation point, exclamation point, exclamation point.